There's a mathematical certainty that has haunted every dominant currency in human history. Not most of them, every single one. And right now, the United States dollar is walking the exact same path that destroyed the Portuguese real, the Dutch guilder, and the British pound sterling. Each believed their supremacy was permanent. Each thought they had broken the cycle. Each was catastrophically wrong. The pattern spans 6 centuries and follows 7 precise stages. Stage 1 through Stage 4 build the empire. Stage 5 begins the decline. Stage 6 accelerates the fall. Stage 7 completes the destruction. And here's what should keep you awake at night. The dollar just entered Stage 5 in 2008, and every indicator suggests we're racing toward Stage 6, faster than any previous reserve currency in recorded history. This isn't economic theory. This isn't political commentary. This is pattern recognition based on documented historical data spanning half a millennium. And once you see the sequence, you'll understand why the world's most powerful nations are quietly preparing for what comes next. Let me show you how this mathematical certainty works, why it's never been broken, and exactly where we stand today. Before we dive into the stages, you need to understand what makes a reserve currency different from any other money. It's not just strength or stability. A reserve currency is the money that other nations must hold in their central banks. It's the currency that prices global commodities. When countries want to buy oil, they need your currency. When they settle international trade, they use your money. When they store wealth safely, they buy your government bonds. This creates what economists call exorbitant privilege. You can create money from nothing and exchange it for real goods produced by other nations. You can run massive trade deficits because foreign countries need to accumulate your currency anyway. You can borrow at artificially low interest rates because global demand for your bonds isn't optional, it's structural. Being the reserve currency is the ultimate economic weapon. It's why empires fight desperately to achieve this status and why they never see the collapse coming until it's too late. Now here are the 7 stages that every reserve currency follows without exception. Stage 1 begins with overwhelming military dominance over critical trade routes. Not just having powerful armed forces, but controlling the pathways where global commerce flows. Portugal achieved this in the 1450s by mastering oceanic navigation while other European powers hugged coastlines. Portuguese warships dominated the Indian Ocean and established fortified trading posts at every strategic choke point. If merchants wanted spices from Asia, they dealt with Portugal on Portuguese terms. The real became the international currency because it was backed by cannons controlling the seas. The Dutch perfected this model in the 1600s. The Dutch East India Company wasn't just a trading enterprise, it was a military superpower with its own army and navy. 40 warships and 20,000 soldiers enforcing Dutch control over global trade routes. Amsterdam became the center of world commerce because Dutch ships dominated every ocean that mattered. Britain took this to unprecedented levels in the 1800s. The Royal Navy possessed more warships than the next 5 nations combined. Every critical maritime choke point from Gibraltar to Singapore was British-controlled. The pound sterling dominated global trade because British naval power made international commerce impossible without it. The United States achieved the same position after 1945. 11 aircraft carrier battle groups patrol every ocean. American bases control or monitor every significant trade route on the planet. This isn't about defending American territory. This is about ensuring that global commerce cannot function without American approval. Stage 2 follows inevitably from Stage 1, massive trade surpluses and the accumulation of global wealth. Once you control the trade routes, advantageous exchange rates flow in your direction. Portugal ran enormous surpluses in the 1500s, buying Asian goods cheaply and selling European products at massive markups. The wealth concentration in Lisbon was so extreme that trade revenues funded the entire government without heavy domestic taxation. The Dutch systematized this approach in the 1600s. Amsterdam became the warehouse of the world where goods from every continent flowed through Dutch merchants who captured the spread between buying and selling prices. They weren't just trading, they were arbitraging on a global scale. Britain ran the largest trade surplus in history during the 1800s. They exported manufactured goods and imported raw materials at prices dictated entirely by London. The surplus built Britain into the wealthiest nation on earth, with financial markets handling more capital than the rest of Europe combined. The United States experienced the most dramatic trade surplus ever recorded from 1945 to 1970. America was the only major industrial power with intact infrastructure after World War II. The trade surplus was so massive that dollars flooded into foreign central banks faster than they could process them. Fort Knox held over 20,000 tons of gold by the 1950s, more than the rest of the world combined. But stage 2 never lasts forever. Success contains the seeds of destruction because overwhelming wealth changes behavior. The reserve currency nation stops producing goods and starts consuming them. Trade surpluses reverse into deficits, and that's when stage 3 arrives. Stage 3 is the formalization of reserve currency status. The world officially recognizes what markets have already decided. For Portugal, this happened in the early 1500s, when European nations and Asian merchants formally adopted the real as the primary international currency. Treaties were written denominating trade in reals. The Dutch guilder achieved formal recognition in the mid-1600s. Even the British East India Company used guilders for transactions, because Amsterdam's financial markets offered the deepest liquidity available anywhere. Britain's moment came at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars. The pound sterling was explicitly recognized as the global standard. The gold standard that most nations adopted was effectively a pound standard because Britain controlled the rules. For the United States, formalization happened at Bretton Woods in 1944. 44 nations met in New Hampshire and formally agreed to make the dollar the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would peg to the dollar. The dollar would peg to gold. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created to manage this system. But here's what nobody explains about stage 3. This moment of maximum formal recognition marks the peak. This is as good as it gets, because formalizing reserve status creates what economists call the Triffin dilemma. For the world to have enough of your currency to use for reserves and trade, you must run trade deficits. You must send your currency abroad. But running endless deficits undermines the value of that currency. You cannot simultaneously be the world's reserve currency and maintain a strong trade balance. It's mathematically impossible. So every reserve currency, once it reaches stage 3, begins sliding inevitably toward stage 4. Stage 4 is where the pattern becomes irreversible. Deficit spending and living beyond means. The reserve currency nation stops producing wealth and starts consuming it. Portugal saw this transformation in the mid-1500s when trade surpluses vanished. Instead of exporting goods, Portugal imported everything from grain to textiles to manufactured products. They paid for this with gold and silver from their colonies, but they weren't producing new wealth. They were spending accumulated wealth from earlier periods. The Dutch followed the identical trajectory in the 1700s. After a century of trade surpluses, the Netherlands became net importers. Amsterdam's accumulated wealth made its citizens comfortable. Why work in factories when you can live off invested capital? Dutch investment shifted from productive trade to passive finance. They became bankers to Europe rather than producers of goods. Britain faced the same reversal by 1900. Trade deficits replaced centuries of surpluses. They imported food, raw materials, and increasingly manufactured goods while paying for everything with returns on overseas investments. British manufacturing declined as factories that had led the Industrial Revolution fell behind American and German competitors. The United States entered stage 4 in 1971 when trade surpluses permanently reversed into deficits. By the 1980s, deficits were growing rapidly. Today, America runs the largest trade deficit in recorded history, importing far more than it exports while paying for this consumption by creating new dollars and exchanging them for real goods produced elsewhere. This works only because the dollar remains the reserve currency. Other nations need dollars for reserves and trade, so they accept newly created currency. But this is the definition of living beyond your means, consuming more than you produce. And it's the exact same pattern that preceded the collapse of every previous reserve currency without exception. Stage 5 represents the point of no return. Currency debasement and money printing become the primary tools for managing unsustainable deficits. Portugal began this descent in the 1550s when the crown couldn't finance its expenditures through normal taxation. They started reducing the silver content in real coins while maintaining face values. What had been pure silver became 50% copper, then 75% copper. Merchants quickly recognized this deception and began refusing reals at face value. Prices exploded across the Portuguese Empire as the currency lost credibility. The Dutch government followed this playbook in the 1700s when wars and colonial maintenance costs exceeded revenues. The guilder had maintained strength through conservative banking practices for generations. But mounting debts forced Amsterdam to expand the money supply beyond what their economy could support. Currency values declined steadily as international merchants sought more reliable alternatives. Britain debased the pound through two devastating world wars. World War I forced them off the gold standard temporarily as they printed money to finance unprecedented military expenditures. They attempted to return to gold in 1925, but chose an overvalued exchange rate that strangled their domestic economy. World War II ended the gold standard permanently as Britain printed whatever amounts were necessary for survival. By 1945, the pound was floating and losing purchasing power rapidly. The United States crossed into stage 5 during the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve created money on a scale never attempted in peacetime. Quantitative easing produced $3.5 trillion new dollars between 2008 and 2014. Then the COVID pandemic triggered even more extreme measures. $7 trillion additional dollars were created from 2020 to 2022. The money supply expanded faster than any period in American history outside of wartime. This represents currency debasement through digital creation rather than reducing precious metal content in coins. But the economic effect remains identical. The dollar's purchasing power declines. Inflation surges to levels not seen in 4 decades. The difference is that dollar debasement exports inflation globally because the dollar serves as the world's reserve currency. When the Federal Reserve prints money, every nation holding dollar reserves watches their wealth erode. Their dollar-denominated debt becomes cheaper to service, but imports from America become more expensive. This creates the foundation for stage 6 because other countries begin questioning why they should accept a currency that loses value through deliberate policy. Stage 6 marks the breaking point where confidence evaporates and the search for alternatives accelerates. International merchants and central banks start shifting away from the failing reserve currency, not through formal agreements, but through millions of individual decisions that create an unstoppable momentum. Portugal lost confidence in the 1570s and 1580s as international traders began demanding payment in Spanish silver instead of Portuguese reals. Trade contracts started denominating transactions in alternative currencies. Asian merchants who had accepted reals for decades began refusing them entirely or demanding substantially larger quantities to compensate for debasement. The Dutch guilder experienced gradual confidence erosion through the 1700s. France, Britain, and other European powers reduced their guilder reserves, while increasing holdings of more stable alternatives. Amsterdam lost its position as Europe's financial center as London's markets became deeper and more liquid. The British pound lost confidence rapidly after World War II, despite victory in the conflict. Britain owed enormous war debts to the United States and other allies, while the pound remained artificially overvalued. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30% overnight. International holders lost almost 1/3 of their wealth instantly. Confidence collapsed as nations shifted reserves from pounds to dollars. The dollar is exhibiting early stage 6 symptoms right now. China and Russia began reducing dollar reserves systematically starting in the 2010s, while purchasing thousands of tons of gold instead. Russia liquidated nearly all U.S. Treasury holdings after 2014 sanctions were imposed. The BRICS nations have announced plans for developing alternative payment systems that bypass dollar-denominated transactions. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil exclusively in dollars since 1974, began accepting Chinese yuan for oil sales in 2023. This breaks a 50-year precedent that formed the foundation of the petrodollar system. Central banks globally are diversifying their reserves away from dollar concentration. The dollar's share of international reserves has declined from 72% in 2000 to 58% in 2024. This represents trillions of dollars shifted into euros, yuan, and gold over just 2 decades. Even smaller nations are negotiating trade agreements that settle in local currencies rather than requiring dollar intermediation. Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia are establishing bilateral arrangements that eliminate dollar dependency for regional commerce. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent a coordinated global movement away from dollar reliance that accelerates as more nations recognize the mathematical inevitability of reserve currency collapse. The pattern shows that stage 6 builds momentum gradually, then suddenly reaches a tipping point where confidence vanishes completely. Stage 7 completes the destruction through replacement and total collapse. This happens not through government decree, but through market forces that make the old currency irrelevant. Merchants refuse it. Central banks dump it. International contracts stop using it. The Portuguese real was replaced by Spanish silver pesos in the late 1500s as Spain's colonial mines produced more silver than the rest of the world combined. Spanish coins became standardized, abundant, and backed by ongoing production, while the real remained debased and declining. The Dutch guilder lost its position to the British pound during the late 1700s and early 1800s. Britain's Industrial Revolution and naval supremacy made the pound the obvious successor as London's financial markets surpassed Amsterdam in depth and liquidity. The British pound was replaced by the US dollar between 1945 and 1960. Britain emerged from World War II bankrupt while America held most of the world's gold and possessed the only intact industrial infrastructure. The transition was formalized at Bretton Woods but took 15 years to complete through market adoption. So what replaces the dollar when stage 7 arrives? That question remains unanswered because no single currency currently meets all the requirements. The replacement needs military control over trade routes, massive trade surpluses, and productive capacity that can support global demand. China possesses enormous trade surpluses and manufacturing capacity, but lacks military control over global shipping lanes. The yuan isn't freely convertible due to capital controls that prevent it from functioning as a true reserve currency. You cannot serve as the world's money if people cannot freely move funds in and out of your financial system. Europe offers the euro as the second most widely held reserve currency, but fundamental structural problems undermine its viability. An aging population, fragmented fiscal policies, and energy dependence create instability. Germany drives production while southern European nations struggle with debt. It's a monetary union without political unity, which history shows cannot survive major crises. Gold attracts increasing attention as central banks purchase more than any time since the 1970s. Gold cannot be printed or debased through political decisions. But physical gold cannot scale to handle trillions in daily global transactions. There simply isn't enough gold available to back the volume of modern international commerce. Some analysts propose that no single currency will replace the dollar. Instead, we might see a multipolar system with regional currencies dominating specific trade blocs. The dollar in the Americas, the euro in Europe, the yuan in Asia, with gold settling transactions between regions. This scenario creates volatility and instability that damages global economic efficiency. The most likely outcome is a chaotic transition period where multiple currencies compete for dominance while none achieves clear superiority. This creates the exact conditions that destroy ordinary people's wealth during currency collapses throughout history. The pattern doesn't lie, and mathematics doesn't care about national pride or military supremacy. 4 reserve currencies have followed these 7 stages across 6 centuries, and each nation believed they were the exception until the very end. The dollar entered stage 5 in 2008 with unprecedented money printing, and every indicator shows we're accelerating toward stage 6, faster than any previous reserve currency. Understanding this isn't about predicting doom, it's about recognizing mathematical certainty so you can position yourself accordingly before the transition completes and takes your wealth with it.